Hi, everyone. This is Kate Mastersaria Reynolds. I am the Teacher Educator Intersection Chair for this year, and I would like to welcome you to our session on self-care, reflecting, recharging, and saying no with Alicia Ambler. Um, if you could please make sure that you mute your mics and say you can pop a hello on the chat box if you'd like, but we were really glad to have you here. And we're going to hold questions until the end of the session. So if you submitted a question already, Alicia is going to talk about them at the end, and then she'll address other questions that you post or you share at the end, unmuting your mic and then sharing your questions. So we're going to leave about 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end. So let me tell you a little bit about Ms. Ambler, Alicia. She has been at the University of Iowa for over 10 years. And she has been teaching basically in higher education, focusing on academic reading, writing, and grammar with international students. Although she has done some academic listening, she's done a very interesting presentation, a perfectly cromulent lesson. I don't know if that's pronounced right, Alicia. That's fun listening in The Simpsons. But she's also done some other things, other presentations at TESOL, on writing, balancing the scales, designing curriculum to address diverse language and writing needs, harnessing the power of focus, exploring mediation for ELT, and integrating typing and computer skills for low-level writers, which I think is a real challenge for a lot of the kids in the schools. But one of the things that I saw when I was reading her CV that I found very fascinating is that she has done some work in prison education, which I think would be emotionally quite taxing. So we were chatting about that a few minutes ago. So I think she probably knows a lot about self-care, having worked in that environment. So on that note, I will turn the mic over to Alicia, and I'm going to mute myself and be a listener. So it's all you, Alicia.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Okay, I hope everybody can hear me okay. Is this sounding all right? Yeah, okay, I can see my own audio. Okay, so first I want to say, thank you, Michelle. I want to say thank you to all of you to take time out of your busy days to come be with me here today. I gave this presentation at TESOL, and my time slot was 7:30 a.m., which I feel like is a really hilarious sort of irony that we're talking about self-care, but that we also all have to take time out of our busy schedules in order to sit down and talk about it. So I want you to know that I recognize that you have given up some of your own personal time to be here, and to those of you that are watching the recorded version, I hope that you are able to get something out of this as well. So before we begin, I'm just going to introduce myself a little bit. My background is in theoretical linguistics, and I've been teaching at the University of Iowa for 10 years, and I have mostly been teaching in our intensive English program and also in our TA prep program. I don't really teach in our credit program, but we do have one of those. So just to give you an overview of what I plan to do today, I have a PowerPoint that gets through some of the stuff that I'd like to talk about. At the very end, I have a slide where I've compiled all of the questions that I received that were submitted by those of you that signed up. So I plan to get to as many of those as I can, although some of them I'll probably address during the presentation itself. And then the last 15 minutes or so, we'll open it up to questions either through the chat box or through your microphone. And so before I begin giving my presentation, I just want to give a little bit of context for my work. I want to say I work in higher education. The university is a state-funded university. Because our intensive English program is self-funded, money is not the hugest obstacle. So I want you to know that that's the context from which I'm able to give this presentation. This is not a research-based presentation. I do include some research, but largely what I'm trying to do is share the concepts that have worked for me and the techniques that I'm working with. But I think a big goal about talking about this topic is to begin the conversation and start it as a cultural value within our departments. So my hope is that this serves as sort of an informal mentoring kind of a session or a jumping off point But I really have noticed that this work is continuing to emerge and to be more recognized, and I'm going to share some of the research, but I hope this spurs some conversations for you within your departments or within your areas. If you are interested in some of the topics that we're talking about here, you might also find the area of positive psychology to be very interesting. It relates to things beyond self-care, but I think it would be really interesting if that's not an area that you've done much reading, that positive psychology might contain a lot of topics that you find interesting. So I'm going to begin by going through some of my slides here. You can see my email address here. If you'd like my slides or any of the other resources, you're welcome to email me. Okay, so here's just an overview of what I'm going to do. So I'm going to begin with giving you permission, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Then I'm going to give a little bit of a background for the conversation and also give some justification, which is sadly needed for this conversation. And then the 3 subpoints that I'm going to talk a little bit about are reflecting, recharging, and saying no. And then we'll have those questions that were already submitted and then whatever questions you might have. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, my background is in theoretical linguistics, and in linguistics we have a concept called the performative utterance. The most straightforward example of a performative utterance is when 2 people get married, they say I do. By saying those words, you do something. And today I'm going to do a little performative utterance to begin this session by giving you permission. So I want to give you permission today to spend your productive time working on yourself rather than your students or your institution. If you're like me and you need to be here, maybe getting this permission will be helpful in letting you move forward. Okay, I have 2 sort of small exercises that I wanted to begin with. These are just sort of thought exercises. The first one I wanted to show you is in Microsoft PowerPoint, I opened up the image finder, the photo inserter, and I just typed in teacher stress. And I wanted to show you some of the images that I received from that search. So on the bottom left, you can see that the information itself can sometimes cause stress to us. In the middle, you can see that teacher burnout is just a very well known and understood phenomenon. You can see the Apple photo, which talks about emotional regulation. On the bottom right, we can see that we're all dealing with external stressors like being overworked and having financial issues within our departments. And then I think at this time of year, we can all really relate to the upper right, which is the beautiful studious owl at the beginning of the year. We all love the sense of optimism. This time of year, that time of year, the beginning of the school year, that's why I love being a teacher. I love getting new supplies and laying out my calendar, and it feels very optimistic and exciting. And the daily stresses just really wear us down until we look like that owl on the right by the end of the year. So my goal with this slide was just to help us see what a cultural phenomenon stressed out teachers really are. When I gave this presentation at TESOL, I had a small enough group that we were able to have a short conversation. What I'd like you to do as just a sort of a thought experiment right now is to just take a moment to think back on your career so far. For me, that's been over 10 years. And I want you to just think about how many teachers have you seen leave during your time. If you can't think of a total number, try thinking about specific teachers that were here with you and are now not, and just try to think about why those teachers left. Okay, before we get started talking about what I want to talk about in terms of self-care, I just wanted to address the vocabulary that we're using. I'm so excited to see that we have people from other countries and different language backgrounds here. And this concept, even for native speakers of English, is complex. And I just wanted to clarify what I'm talking about. When you Google self-care, these are the kinds of things that you might see: the candles, the face masks, the glass of coffee or wine. And I'm not trying to describe these as invalid types of self-care, but I just want to clarify that this is not the focus of my presentation. This might be part of self-care for you. It might not be, and I also want us to recognize that this is a very privileged understanding of the concept of self-care, and it's not really the focus of my presentation today. So on this next slide, you can see a face that I hope is familiar to you, but if it's not, her name is Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde was a Black lesbian poet and civil rights activist. If you have not read her piece called The Master's Tools, I cannot recommend it highly enough. I have it linked at the end of my presentation, but you can also just Google Audre Lorde, The Master's Tools. But I chose this quote from her to sort of clarify what I'm talking about when I'm talking about self-care. So Audre Lorde said, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. I think we all know that these times are very complex and very challenging for people who are doing the work that we are doing, especially for those of you who are in the public sector. And so I want to make it clear that when I talk about self-care, I'm not trying to talk about pampering. I'm trying to talk about taking care of ourselves physically and emotionally and professionally so that we can be here to do this really hard and really important work that at this point in time feels almost revolutionary. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background and some justification, I'd actually like to start with a second quote because I think it's very interesting. This is a study from a book that was written in 1995, and Pennington is a great author if you're interested in work about teacher burnout. And one thing that I found was really interesting was this finding that teachers who had been surveyed showed less depersonalized attitudes towards their students than any other educator or human services group for comparative data, for which comparative data is available. And these are ESL instructors. So I think we can all relate to this idea that ESL teachers are more personal with our students and sometimes care more about our students than some other teachers do. Part of that is the nature of our students, but I also think part of that is the nature of the type of person who takes this job. The other finding that I wanted to share with you comes from this Ingersoll paper that was written in 2002. And the first part says the teaching occupation suffers from chronic and relatively high annual turnover compared to many other occupations, which I think many of us are familiar with. And the data suggests that after just 5 years, between 40 and 50% of all beginning teachers have left the profession. Again, these two concepts are anecdotal and I think obvious to people who do this work, but seeing them here in black and white is so staggering to me. If you have taught for more than 5 years, as I have, and some of the other teachers I've worked with have, I think you can attest to how much knowledge builds over time and how challenging the first few years are, especially if you're entering a new program or you didn't have a solid practicum. It can be a very challenging first few years, and it's completely understandable that many people leave, but this concept that half of all teachers don't last for more than 5 years really, I think, underlies the knowledge loss that is a result of this high turnover. I'm also going to share some information with you today from a researcher named Percy. She's out of UMD, and I wrote her email address up here because she has a couple things that I find really interesting, and I'm going to share those with you here today. She is writing a chapter on self-care as a core teacher training value. I think that's a super interesting area of work. And one of the questions that I received from the audience was, is there any research that I know of that's being done about this? And this is the best stuff that I've seen so far. So the first half comes from a PowerPoint that she gave, I believe, at TESOL, and then the second half comes from her chapter with it, which is forthcoming. I tried my best to just highlight some of the most important information from her work, but she's very willing to share and interested in collaborating with people. So if that is something that is interesting to you or you would like to know a little bit more about it, her email address is up there. So in her 2018 presentation, she referenced that teachers are highly vulnerable, which is something that, or novice teachers are highly vulnerable, which is something that we can relate to, I think, and also is borne out in that evidence that I showed you before. And also, very clearly she illustrates that current teacher education programming just doesn't address emotional needs. It tends to be focused on student learning outcomes and are we meeting the curricula, and there's very little in most current teacher ed programming that addresses the emotional needs of teachers. This isn't surprising, but it is, as we've seen, very detrimental. In her focus on ESLL, she showed us some really interesting concepts. For those of you that are in K through 12, you relate to this a lot, but also in higher education, we have this too, where generally ESL teachers are not very well understood in their institutions. Most people within the institution at large don't quite understand what those of us that teach ESL do. I can't tell you how many times, literally yesterday, I told someone I teach ESL and he said, "Oh, what language do you speak?" So I think we can all relate to this idea of people not really knowing what we do here day to day. And also that often our institutions don't value their input. Because they don't understand it, they don't tend to be to put as much value on it. I think that this is a really important concept, and I'm really glad to see it in her chapter because it puts words to a feeling that I think many of us have had. Another thing that she points out in this chapter is that many of our students have traumatic backgrounds. This is especially true if you're working with immigrant students or refugee students, but when we deal with education, trauma-informed education is a new concept, and it's something that ESL teachers have had to sort of deal with on a day-to-day level, more so than many other instructors have had to. And I also just wanted to note, she mentioned as well that many teachers have a history of trauma, and again, when we talk about trauma-informed education, we tend to be focusing on the students and very little on how teachers who carry trauma deal with that during their day-to-day. I think we all know that being a teacher is emotionally very taxing, and if you have a background that involves trauma, that can add an extra layer of challenge for you. Oh, and I should just mention that this was a qualitative research study that she did. It's very interesting. And then lastly, of course, we have the current cultural and political climate, which is very divisive and very challenging. So these are all concepts that she's talking about in that chapter. Again, if you would like to talk to her about it, you're free to contact her, but it's very interesting work. Okay, so now that I've kind of hopefully made it clear for you what the literature says so far about this work and teacher retention and self-care and some of the work that's being done, I'm going to just go ahead and dive into the presentation that I gave at TESOL. And I just want to emphasize that what I'm talking about here are things that have been useful or helpful for me. And again, these should just be kind of a spin-off for you to start your own concepts. And because we only have 45 minutes, I can't talk about everything, but I do want to just kind of give a broad overview. So before we begin by talking about reflecting, I wanted to read you this piece from a paper that was written in 2013. And the author said, by reflecting on their practice, feelings, and self-beliefs, and not only acting by intuition, teachers can expand their knowledge, broaden their repertoire of teaching strategies, and improve the opportunities of learning offered to students. So I think we all know intuitively that reflecting systematically on our practice and our feelings and our beliefs about ourselves, that's an important thing to do. But we also have to remember that it's not something that is required. It's generally not something that's described in our contracts that we have from work. And so it's something that we have to deliberately make space for in our time. And I'll talk more about how I've done that. I do want to reference this. If you were at TESOL this year, this author of this study cited the person who gave one of the keynotes about teacher motivation. So this paper focused on self-belief, about how a teacher decides whether or not they are efficacious in their teaching. And so if teacher motivation is something that you're interested in, this paper is interesting, and there are other citations within it that are also interesting. Also, before we move forward with talking about reflecting, one of the things that I've been examining a lot with my students is the cultural educational values that they were exposed to as children. The thing I think that's important to remember about values is that they tend to be not something that we realize we're doing. They're not overt. They kind of just are communicated to us. I'll tell you about this PowerPoint. I teach in our intensive English program, and I teach the highest level right now. So these are students who will hopefully matriculate to university study at the end of the semester. And our largest demographic group are Chinese, and also some Middle Eastern folks. So Chinese and Arabic are dominant languages. One of the things that I noticed about my students, who are, like I said, our highest level students, is that I would frequently receive their assignments at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, the night before the assignment is due, and we have class at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so I was realizing that they were really not taking care of themselves, and that they had also really not been taught time management and how to sort of plan ahead and manage their own time, which I think those of you that deal with young adult students, I think you can probably relate to this feeling that many of them are only children and have been very well parented and very well taken care of. And then when they come to university and they have to study by themselves, they lack a lot of those self-control skills that we all kind of need to learn our way through. So I created a PowerPoint about self-care for my students. Some of you asked how do you keep these values prominent in your classroom, and I think introducing them to your students and talking about them actively can help them understand your desire for self-care, as well as be a really important tool that you can give them. So one of the things, what the slide that I've shown you here is, so first of all, we begin with a discussion of self-care, and then we do a short guided meditation just to get them grounded. I'll talk a little bit more about meditation later. And I show them pictures of stressed out students, just like I showed you pictures of stressed out teachers. And then I made this slide by thinking about the educational culture that I had internalized as a young person, and I also asked some of my colleagues and some of my students about these lessons that we've learned. So things like work as hard as you possibly can and don't take a break. Fun is for after all your work is done, if there's time for it at all. It's important to not ask for help because that makes you seem like you're weak. And then the last one I really love, comparing yourself to your peers is useful and will tell you something about yourself. These are all concepts that we pass on through our educational system to our students. And I think it's important for us to remember it's not whether or not we're passing on values, we are passing values on to our students. And for those of us that are trying to orient our students to a different educational culture, we have to be really conscious of where they have come from, what they've internalized from before, and also what we're teaching them about what teachers do and what students do through our own behavior. So somebody asked me about motherhood. Becoming a mom really changed the way that I think about myself because someone is watching me. And I think being a teacher has made me really conscious about when I act, what am I showing my students? What am I teaching them? So if I teach them that I will answer emails at 11:30 at night, I'm telling them that that's a reasonable expectation to have of a teacher. And that's not, to me, a reasonable expectation to have of a teacher. So having these things be in the forefront of your classroom and referenced often, and remembering that you are passing on values is an important tool, I think, for reflecting on our practice as teachers. I have this PowerPoint that I do with my students. It's linked at the end of this PowerPoint, but if you'd also like it, you could just email me directly. Okay, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about what has worked for me in terms of reflecting. This is a picture of the actual planner that I use. It's called a Happy Planner. You can use whatever planner you like. Oh, and I should say that this is a teacher version of the planner. They have like their own, just like a personal one for keeping your schedule. I think planning and goal setting is really important. It's probably a practice that we all do. We all spend lots of time planning, but I think it's important for us to remember that we need to also include goal setting, and our goals need to be measurable. So not things just like improve, but things that we can measure. And that it's like drafting, where we need to have big and small goals and we need to return to them. I don't know about you, but I have a habit of starting with very clear plans, and then by the end of the semester, I've stopped planning so clearly and I'm just finishing everything. I think it's really important for us to make a habit of returning to our plans and checking in and evaluating what's been useful and what has not. I'm a very visual pen and paper kind of person, so I like the Happy Planner, but also using a Google Calendar or an iCal would be a great way to have all your planning out and then have reminders to yourself at the end to return back to your planning to see what's effective for you. So for example, it's my goal at the beginning of each semester to have my large assignments planned out and staggered, but not my day-to-day. When I first started teaching, I used to literally list every single thing that I wanted to do for each lesson for each day to make sure that I was getting to all our curricular objectives. But I noticed that those very detailed planners stopped being useful for me and started becoming a chore. And so by returning to that type of planning and looking at how it's working for me, I've really settled on a method that is more broad and just discusses the biggest assignments. I also find that just for me personally as a teacher, if I have rigid expectations, I will meet them. But if I have more open-ended goals, I tend to be more responsive to my students because there's room for flexibility, whereas if I have a very clear plan, I tend to stick to that and maybe sacrifice being responsive to my students. So that's just my personal balance between planning and goal setting. Okay, so another really important part about reflecting is going back. As I said, most of us tend to be planners and maybe have trouble returning back. So one of my favorite techniques that I have found for reflecting and that I'm trying to spread around is journaling, either by speaking. If you're a teacher like me, you're probably a speaker, or by journaling, by writing to yourself. And we do this with our students all the time, but very few of us, I think, do it for ourselves. So for what I've done up here is I put up some prompts, and I've taken these from a couple different places and created some of them myself. But these are questions that you can ask yourself to help at the end of a week, at the end of a month, at the end of a semester, at the end of a unit, to help make all the work that we have done in that month or that semester or that unit to be more effective and more useful. So these questions, I think, are open-ended enough, but also specific enough. So some of my favorite questions here are, what felt true to me and what didn't? And what am I proud of? What have I done that's energizing to me? What, when I look back, is the most important work that I feel like that I can't wait to tell anybody out? At the beginning of this, somebody asked me about prison education, and I could talk to you about it all day. And having that moment of reflection helps me see that while that was a very challenging experience and it made me work really hard, it's the thing that makes me get excited when I wake up in the morning. And then those, very detailed schedules, that felt not super true to me, and it was definitely more draining than it was energizing. So that reflection was a chance for me to step back and say, I don't think that's really working for me. Another really important question that I love on here is, what choices have I given my students? This is another one that has become very relevant to me as a mother. How often am I telling someone to do something when I could really give them choices? My students tend to have much more buy-in when I give them some control. And so I'd work really hard to deliberately build in choices because it makes my job easier because I get to do the work. It makes them more motivated, and our students are such interesting, cool people. It's so exciting to see the things that they do that I never would have anticipated. So other things that are here in the reflection, what evidence do I have that I'm improving, right? The previous question, what evidence do I have that my students are improving? This is pretty straightforward. What evidence do I have that I'm improving? How's my professional development coming? What am I doing to get better? Another question about habits. What habits are making me successful? What habits have been barriers? How can I get help for things that I can't figure out by myself? Again, I think teachers are self-starters. There's a culture of self-reliance, and I think it's important for us to think about, of the things that I'm not meeting, how can I get help to do those things instead of just sitting there with an unmet goal? what am I doing that isn't productive, and what can I prioritize differently? I think we all get into habits and routines, and we have to always ask, is this being productive? Is this helping me? And then, of course, am I spending enough time with my friends and my family? And what am I doing to take care of myself? These are things that I think we should all have to answer to ourselves on a regular basis. Lastly, I would like to just put in a word for therapy. I have a very, very thoughtful, kind patient partner, and he listens to me whenever I need to talk. But I think those of us that care for students hold their stories in us, and some of those stories are wonderful and thoughtful and so inspiring, but many of them are very difficult and challenging, and we are often asked to make choices as teachers that I feel like have no good choice. And that's a really hard thing to do, and it's an emotional burden that all of us carry around, and a good therapist can really help you have a place to put those feelings and have a place to put those stories that doesn't weigh on other important people in your life. So yeah, I can't advocate enough for therapy. If you work at a large institution, their employee assistance program might be able to help you, but I also find word of mouth is the best for finding a good therapist. Okay, so I'm going to talk just briefly about recharging. Again, I think this relates to some cultural stuff that we were talking about before, but I wanted to just talk about personal and professional recharging things. So again, I'm mostly talking about what has worked for me, but professionally in-house, I think it's really important to give yourself permission for movement breaks. I teach usually 3 hours a day, and at the end of the semester we also walk around campus a lot, and at the end of the semester I have to fill out forms for all of my students, and so there's about a week where I'm really sitting at my desk all day long. And for years I would get so cranky at that time of year, and I could not understand why. And now I realize that it was because my body was very used to moving, to getting up and walking around and moving around a room, and sitting at a desk in front of a computer all day made me not the best self that I could be. So I have some friends who use Fitbits that every 20 minutes or so buzzes at them to stand up and move around, but also think about how you can build movement into your own class. So I tend to walk around while my students are working. I tend to squat and get up and move just because I know sitting at a desk doesn't work best for me. Healthy eating is super important. We all tell this to our students, right? Get up early and have breakfast before class. Your brain is a muscle. And yet we all don't necessarily take the same care of ourselves. So many of my colleagues keep, high protein snacks in our desks, but it's important to think about healthy eating, good food, and also, if at all possible, not eating at your desk, not sitting in front of your computer. I'm definitely guilty of this one too, but I really think that just like the movement breaks and the brain breaks, if we take this period of time to nourish ourselves, we'll actually have more energy going forward than if we would have just powered through. Again, this is advice that I think we give to our students. Many of my students, I won't go back to the slide, but there's a slide that says keep working until all your work is done, don't take any breaks. Many of my students will literally sit down and study for 3 or 4 hours at a time, and then they don't understand why they don't remember anything that they studied. And so I have to teach them and also model for them that taking breaks actually makes you a more efficient learner. Taking the time to nourish yourself will make you a better teacher. I have a great department. I feel like I've talked a lot about it already, but we have professional development meetings usually 3 times a semester, I want to say. And one of the regular professional development meetings that we have is just titled Work Smarter, Not Harder. And at this meeting, we all share things that we're doing in class to try to, with our work, to try to make things easier for us. And I've gotten some really great advice. One simple example that I use all the time now is that if students are taking a reading writing class, to assess their reading quiz responses for writing. So instead of grading something separate for writing, I'm asking them to use their writing skills when they're answering questions about reading. This is a great example of working smarter, not harder. And again, we can think about how we can pass this down to our students. And I think I've talked a little bit about it before, but this concept of self-care it has to exist on a departmental level. That has to be a value that a department has. It's very difficult to sort of individually do this work if you're not supported from without. Formal and informal mentorship is also huge in terms of recharging. It gives you a person to encourage you and to share their experiences with, so that you don't feel so isolated and that you can get inspired by new ideas. My department previously had formal mentorship, but largely relies on informal mentorship. Outside of the department, many people run critical pedagogy groups. So these are groups that are basically like book clubs, but they rely on reading articles about pedagogy to have conversations about it. And I think that's a really useful way to learn, but also to share your time with other people. And then lastly, I really want to advocate for retreats. There are teacher-specific retreats, and there's also such a thing as a silent retreat. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but in silent retreats, you go alone, and there are places where you can do these, and they'll feed you. They take care of everything for you. They're often donation-based, and when you do them, you agree that you won't speak to anyone for a certain period of time. Maybe this is an afternoon, maybe this is a weekend, maybe this is a whole week. But as teachers, we spend a lot of time talking, and there is something very recharging about just being quiet and being with yourself. So those are some professional ways to sort of renew yourself. I also wanted to talk about some personal things that have worked for me. I belong to a book club that meets monthly, and that book club is made up of social workers and local food advocates. I am a local food advocate, and so that's how I ended up in that group. And it has been so inspiring to me, the work that we've done in this book club. A lot of the materials that I've used for my classes have either come from or been inspired by the books that we read. I think reading for me is one of those things that recharges me, but also ends up giving me a lot of material. Mindfulness-based stress reduction is a program that was created by John Kabat-Zinn. It was actually created for folks who have chronic pain, and the concept of it's a course. The concept of the course is your pain is not leaving, and for me, the stress of teaching is not leaving. There is stress here. Mindfulness-based stress reduction helps you become more skillful in the way that you respond to stress. It's a 16-week intensive course. It requires, I think the class that I took met once a week for 2 hours, and the homework was between 30 and 45 minutes a night. Yes, it's a lot of work, but it has been a life changer for me and for a lot of my colleagues. At my university, it's reimbursed if you participate here on campus. At the end of this PowerPoint, I have a link to a free online version of it. So if you'd like to do it or to see what it's about without dropping down any money or taking on the time commitment, there's a resource for you here at the end. But yeah, it's called MBSR, and it's incredible. For me, also for recharging, I do a type of yoga once a week that's called Iyengar yoga. BKS Iyengar is a guru who really helped popularize yoga in the West, and the idea of Iyengar yoga is that you're really spending time being present in your body. So it's not really flow-based, but you just spend a lot of time thinking. There are no mirrors in the room, which I also really appreciate. So I spend about an hour and 45 minutes a week just trying to be present in my body. I find that super recharging. I've also written here that it's really important for me to give myself permission to be present when I'm with my family. So I have time set aside for my work if I need to work from home. But it's also really important for me to say this is family time, no multitasking, having good boundaries, which I'm going to talk about again in a minute. So I schedule personal time with my family the same way I schedule any other appointment. It's not an empty hole in case something else comes in. It's there, and I often will decline things to make space for that. And a lot of you are interested in the saying no section, so I'm going to move forward. Fiber art and gardening are two other things that I love. Okay, let's talk about saying no. This was everyone's favorite part. This is why I think a lot of people are here. I will say it's really hard. It goes against the culture of I'm from the Midwest. We don't say no. But I think it's really important for us to start talking about it and thinking about how we can do it. I will note that a big part of it has to do with departmental and institutional culture, and that these things can change, but it does take time. And it also has to do with job duties. I had a question that hopefully I'll get to about job duties. In my appointment as a lecturer, my teaching and service and professional development are identified. They're broken down, so I'm 80% teaching, 10% service, 10% professional development, and having those ratios clear makes it much easier for me to decline things because it's in black and white. I can say I've already allotted 10% of my time to service. I can't take anything extra on right now. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about boundary setting, because that's often what we mean when we're talking about saying no. Boundary setting is hard. If you're interested in boundary setting work, Brene Brown, B-R-E-N-E-E, like Brene but with a B, Brene Brown has some really wonderful sociological work on healthy boundary setting. I just want to remind you that, first of all, over-involvement is just as detrimental as under-involvement. It's really easy for us to look at a person and say, well, they're not doing enough work. But I want us to remember that it is just as destructive to have a person who's doing too much work. I feel like culturally, it's very easy for us to say, oh, they're under-involved or they're lazy, but we have a harder time pinpointing over-involvement. But I really, truly believe it is just as detrimental. I also, as I was talking about with the student side before, want to make it clear that when we set boundaries, we're modeling that for our students. We're teaching them how to be a healthy person by setting firm boundaries. And then lastly, the unfortunate thing about boundaries is that they are frequently tested and have to be reset over and over. So setting a limit once is usually not enough. A big boundary for me is email availability, teaching students about at what point you will no longer be available by email, and then you no longer get these emergency emails. And then the last one that I wrote here is that we really need to practice setting boundaries as quickly as things happen, especially issues in our classroom. There's a really interesting area of work called research in education on infants. I think I have it backwards, it's RIE, I believe. The woman who does this is Magda Gerber, and she works with children, but I've used a lot of her techniques in my classroom. And when a child is displaying a behavior that she's not acceptable with, that she doesn't find acceptable, it's very important that I get addressed early and firmly say, I won't let you do this. You need to stop doing that. You may not do that here. I think that sometimes it's hard for us to draw these boundaries with our students in the classroom because we don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. But I find that addressing an issue early is much easier than trying to fix it after the toothpaste is out of the tube. So the way that I like to think about saying no is that I have set some priorities for myself. So at the bottom, you can see that I talk about my schedule. If you have a solid schedule, including, like I said, time for your family blocked off, it's much easier to decline when you have a sense of how many appointments per week is optimal for you. And you could say, actually, I have too much going on that week. How about the next week? Or that's just not going to work for me. So I'm going to show you my personal and my professional priorities. So my personal ones are time with my family and time with myself. I have to be with my people, and I also have to be alone sometimes. So again, I put those on my schedule and I guard them carefully. Professional priorities for me, these are the things that are really important to me. Maybe you picked up some of these. And so when I'm thinking about taking on something professionally, like when I was invited to teach at the prison, for example, I kind of looked over this list of my professional priorities. So I have creativity. Many of our students lack this background. Practicality. Many of our students are trained in writing 5-paragraph essays, but I'm not doing that because they don't really write very many of them in college. In terms of efficiency, I'm always interested in systematizing or institutionalizing knowledge. I like my work to be student-centered with high levels of motivation and good buy-in. I always want to make the field better. I want to pay attention to marginalized folks, and I want to use the work that I have done in my career to help create more justice for all. So when I was invited to teach out of the prison, it was a time commitment, but I also ticked off 2 or 3 different things on my professional priorities list. And I said, I can put these things on my CV. It's going to help these things that I want to get better at, and it's going to help the situation for people other than me. I was invited to do some other work by the Office of Sexual Misconduct Response Coordinator, who deals with sexual misconduct on campus. I do a lot of work with them, but I was invited to do something else, and I found that it was a population that I did not want to work with, and I knew would not fit with my schedule. So I had to say no because it didn't match enough of my professional priorities. So sitting down and doing this thought exercise for yourself, what are my professional and personal priorities, can really give you a metric for which to measure things against. Okay, so I'm at 12:44 according to my clock. So first of all, there's my email address. Again, I just threw it up there. And then that's Piercy's email address if you're interested in the PowerPoints or that chapter that I talked about. I'm going to put the question slide up in a minute. Here are my references if you would like to look through those. Here are a couple further reading things. There's the master's tools, there's the mindfulness-based stress reduction, and there's my student self-care PowerPoint if you'd like. And then really quickly, I'm just going to zip through some of these questions and then open it up to questions for people if anything comes in. So first of all, yes, number 1S, are there gender-based social expectations? Absolutely, no question. We need to continue to practice and do research on it, and the culture is continuing to shift. So yes, it's a really big deal. Yes, you can't escape the systems that exist, but work is being done. In terms of procrastination, I think it really helps to have that self-care conversation early. Like I said before, I show that to my students early on in the semester, and then we can have that conversation about it throughout the semester. And scheduling as much as you can ahead of time. I do reverse scheduling with my students. Number 3 is, should we draw a line between our professional and personal life? Absolutely, please. Number 4, wearing different hats, I think has worked for me because I let go of the concept that it will ever look the same and it will ever be balanced, that it's going to change all the time. I had 2 questions about student evaluations. And I think that student evaluations are really important. Again, I have a very supportive department, so they expect our first session of evaluations not to be awesome. And also, my boss does a really good job of just discounting the ones that clearly seem like an angry student. My feeling about negative comments is, if it's a out of left field negative comment, it really doesn't bother me because I have a healthy sense of self. I've evaluated what I think is important, and I've thought about it from my perspective a lot. If I see a comment and I can't let it go, that usually means that it's getting at something that I don't feel so sure about or I need to do some work on. So usually those negative comments really point to me for work that I need to do. I love being a teacher because making mistakes is a really big part of the process. That's the best. You can't make mistakes if you're a physicist or a neurosurgeon, but you get to make mistakes a lot as a teacher. I think that's great. Let's see, for number 7, I want to get tenure. Most important things to say yes to, things that you can put on your CV, things that are related to education and helping international students, social stuff, other stuff that doesn't align with your personal and professional priorities, pass on. Number 8 is the best way to say no but still show you care. If you Google active listening, you'll find a lot of really great resources. A daily self-reflection is too much for me, maybe weekly or monthly. Number 10, ask for advice for academic mothers. Oh my gosh, there's so much that I could talk about with this one, but having really firm boundaries and being really present with your family and being really present with your students has worked for me. And then I already shared that research. And then for number 12, drawing the line, I think the most important thing to do is to try to have communication with people who are responsible for your paycheck as much as you can. And for me, that dialogue has opened the door to us being able to have healthy conversations about saying no and prioritizing, because I think we all know we can't say yes to everything. That's why you're here. Okay, I went a little bit over. It's 12:48, so I'm going to go back to the slide with my email address in case you have questions. And now would be the time if anybody wants to chime in with their microphone or type into the chat. I can see the chat too. Does anybody have any questions?
If you have a question, please feel free to unmute your mic and ask it. I'm sure that the rest of us would really like to hear them.
Thank you, Roberta.
So it looks like everyone is being real quiet here. Yes, this session was a recorded session, so I will send out to all participants. This is Kate speaking, by the way. I will send out to all of the participants and all those people who were not able to attend the link to the TESOL YouTube channel where you can find this, and all the visuals will be there. Are there any certificates? I don't know if TESOL gives out any certificates for this. I don't think we have any for the TEIS, the Teacher Educator Interest section. If you need something for your work, thank you, Michelle, for letting us know. We'd be happy to send an email about your attendance. How would you recommend instructors communicate wishes for a retreat to their supervisors?
Well, retreats for me are usually done during personal time or during breaks. So that's not usually something that we would do during work. But I think in terms of talking to your supervisors, I think one of the things to remember is that, as I discussed earlier, not everyone is equally aware of the work that we do. And the level of emotional commitment that it requires. So I think one of the things to recognize about starting to have this conversation about needing more room for self-care and needing more time is that you'll be tasked with educating people a little bit about what you do. So once a year, the regents in Iowa ask for a faculty survey where they have faculty just write down literally what they're doing every day, each day of the week. And that might be a really interesting place to begin, just sort of an activity inventory and talking with your supervisor about it in that way. Just recognizing that they need to have the information before they can accurately respond to your request. I hope that makes sense. And then Caroline said, do you collaborate with other teachers in terms of reflecting activities? Yes, formally and informally. Informally, there are a lot of happy hours that become sort of therapy sessions for all of us. And then, as I mentioned before, we have professional development meetings, and I recently presented this self-care talk at one of our professional development meetings and showed the slide with those reflection questions, and people really enjoyed those and found them useful. We tend to be chatty folks, so one of the most useful things for us is the department will often have either a regular meeting or a professional development meeting, and in the last 5 or 10 minutes of that meeting, it's kind of just time for these informal talks to happen. That's a great way to do it. We also have end of semester meetings once a year where we all share what has been working with us. One thing we struggle with is sharing conference proceedings, the things that we have either presented at conferences or we've seen at conferences. So what we've been trying to do is every time there's a big conference, so we just had our regional mid-TESOL, and then TESOL of course, where everybody uploads one slide of something that either they presented on or that they saw, and then we do just really quick go around the room talking about the most important information that they saw. This way, When we go to conferences, we feel better about dividing and conquering. We're able to all see more, knowing that people are going to be bringing things back for us. And we also learn from the type of sessions that we maybe wouldn't have gone to otherwise based on the description. So that's been super helpful for us. And again, that could just be done on the computer. It doesn't have to be a meeting, but it was really helpful to have that kind of conversation. And again, having these conversations, talking to each other about reflection serves a purpose in and of itself. Thank you for your questions. Are there any others?
Hi, Alicia, this is Kate. I was just thinking, one of the things that seems to happen a lot is that we get into these negative cycles either with ourselves or with each other about teaching, and sometimes it's really hard to break those cycles. And I think that the kind of negativity cycle that folks get into can be triggered by a variety of different factors. For example, the budget crunches, or student enrollments, or expectations to do more, or evaluations. So all of these things kind of tend to trigger kind of these negative cycles. And I think, for at least through my experience when I'm working with others, if we are in a negative space, it's really hard to kind of reorient to the positive. And I think when we can't do that, that we tend to, it drains us more. So I was wondering if you had any ideas in terms of that reorientation toward being more positive.
Absolutely. That's a great, man, you touched on so many different things. First of all, I did mention positive psychology at the beginning of the talk. It is a really interesting area of research because for whatever reason, negativity is so much more salient to folks than positivity. So I work with graduate students and I'll tell them, like, it's often like I'm standing here trying to punch as many holes as I can into your presentation, and my end goal is to make it better. But it really can feel like I'm standing here just like ripping you to shreds. And part of that is the nature of our job, right? We're often, you know, spending our time sort of looking for errors. So there's no question that negative comments are just much more clear to people and easier for us to hold on to than positive things. So I'll say for me personally, taking responsibility for my attitude has made a huge difference, recognizing that I bring something to the classroom. So I talked to a chef once and I said, what do you want your eaters to know? And he said, I want them to recognize that when they come, they have to participate. They have to bring a positive attitude if they want to enjoy the dinner. If you just come and you want to be impressed and you come in with that kind of an attitude, you're not going to have as much fun or enjoy it as much as if you bring that positive attitude. So I think it's really important for us to all recognize that as teachers, we get to really set the mood in the room. And if we're having a bad day, everybody knows. We're not fooling anybody. So taking a little responsibility for that. For me personally, the mindfulness work has helped me catch myself when I'm in thought loops, which are not particularly reasonable. And that practice of recognizing that I'm going down a negative route has helped me reroute myself more effectively when it's happening. It's important to remember that we shouldn't shame or judge ourselves for feeling negative, that that's a normal way of feeling and there's nothing wrong with that, but that if we can choose to change our mindset, we can be a little bit more productive. And also recognizing our triggers. You mentioned triggers. All of us have them, and it's easy to internalize that that's a bad thing or that we just need to avoid them, but recognizing that those things are not going to go away. Student evaluations and budgets are a part of our lives, and they don't threaten our sense of self. I'm still me, even if I don't have this job. I'm still me, even if the student doesn't pass. And having that wider view has helped me a lot. And then also just having people that I know I can go to, or I can say, I'm having a really crappy day, and they'll say, let's go get some ice cream. So yeah, it's a long process, but if you view each one of those difficulties as a learning opportunity, that each time something challenging happens to you or each time you're caught in a negative loop, if you can use that to improve your skill at getting out of that, instead of viewing it as an obstacle in your way, your relationship with it will be more productive, I think.
Great. Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you
So
for that
I
question.
want to thank I want to thank everyone for attending. I'll be sending out the link to the YouTube video on the T-cell the YouTube channel, and look forward to seeing more discussion on this topic on the My T-cell page, TEIS. I'll be sending out a prompt if you all want to continue the conversation or share any resources. I just shared a YouTube video on positive psychology, the science of happiness. So hopefully that will kind of trigger some more conversation. Thank you, Alicia, for taking your time and sharing your thoughts with us. We're all so grateful. It was very informative. And I appreciate you really delving into this in an area that we need so much help these days as teachers, because there's so much pressure put upon us. So anyway.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, no problem. Michelle, Kim at T-Cell Central, thanks for setting up the webinar. Appreciate it. And everyone have a great day. Thanks for attending.
Thank
Bye.
you.